Okay, very good morning to everyone watching and those watching a little bit later. Doing a broadcast on Monday morning because yesterday we had a couple of problems, internet, and some issues on my behalf during the session. I think I did it twice and didn't manage to get it uploaded. But anyway, today we are breaking with our normal series on Paul and his early undisputed books. We finished off Second Corinthians. And we're doing an interjection today and doing a little session, which is a bonus session for our Rediscovering the Beauty of the Gospels study group. This session, if you're in the study group, this is Appendix C, Papias and the evidence for who wrote the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. If you're just watching by accident, the new title is Why Matthew and Mark Probably Did Not Write the New Testament Gospels of Matthew and Mark, as we call them. Okay, so this is a rather important subject. It's important because as Christians we build literally our lives and our expectation of the future, not only of this life but the one after that. We build it on these Gospels, and we believe they're authoritative. We believe they are inspired. And therefore, the issue of authorship for us is not something we can just brush aside. Issue of authorship should not be taken lightly and should be investigated properly. And so this is why we're doing this in our series on rediscovering the beauty of the Gospels. One of the main factors to understanding the Gospels for what they are, for what they should be, would be who actually wrote them. And so here we have a bit of a tension. For the last 150 years, scholars have become weary of the tradition, the Christian tradition that says that Matthew, the tax collector, wrote the Gospel according to Matthew, and Mark, the companion of Peter, wrote the Gospel according to Mark. Our tradition says that Matthew was written first, and then Mark later just kind of wrote a summary according to some of the things he learned from Peter. So the question is, why is there a tension between our Christian tradition and what scholars have discovered, or the data we now know concerning this issue? Well, to give you an idea, many scholars and most critical scholars and even some rather conservative scholars have realized that the internal evidence of the Gospels seem to stand in tension with this tradition. Now, my intention here today is not to make a case for exactly why they don't accept the tradition, but I'll give you 4 very quick pointers. These seem to be like the main issues, and I'm going to really summarize them. There's a lot of meat to them, which we can't cover in this short session. 4 simple reasons why they believe that the Gospels were not written by Mark and Matthew, and we're just going to be dealing with Mark and Matthew today. So let me see if I can remember them. I didn't make any notes on these. The first one is simply that Mark and Matthew is not written in the first person, right? They are always writing in like the third, or it's they went and they said, and Jesus said to them. It's never I went or we went and we got there and Jesus said to us. So just from a literary point of view, just reading them for what they say without having the tradition in the back of your mind, it doesn't look like they were written by people who were actually part of the narrative. It looks like they were written by people later pointing back to the narrative. So they're not written in the first person. That's the first obvious thing. The second, and actually very important thing as well, is that these Gospels are written anonymously. Now, I know that when you open your Bible, you might have a title, the Gospel according to Matthew and the Gospel according to Mark. But as far as we know, the early manuscripts do not have these titles, as far as we can tell. And the authors themselves don't make any claim as to who it is who wrote these Gospels. In other words, they are actually written anonymously. They don't start like the letters of Paul, like the epistles of Paul, that starts with Paul, a servant, so that you kind of, all right, this is Paul writing. Matthew doesn't start like that. Mark doesn't start like it. Neither does Luke or John. Um, so that they're written anonymously. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but for the first and early second century, this is a big deal because authority and authenticity was ascribed by who the author was. And so it seems very strange that if these were the companions of Jesus, the actual eyewitnesses to his life, that they would have used their name. I mean, it was so important that scriptures were assigned to people that we know that people assigned them names falsely. To some other writings. We have many examples. Maybe a good example today is just the Gospel of Thomas, probably written in the second century by someone who was not Thomas. But yet, the writer claims that it is Thomas who is writing this piece of, it's called the Gospel of Thomas. Why does he do that? Well, nobody takes the writing seriously unless it has a credible author. And so it seems very strange to us that these authors, if they were Matthew or Mark, that they did not add their names or just at least mention, this is my gospel, I am Matthew, the disciple of the Lord. So these are two reasons. Let me see if I can remember the third one. The third one is, well, actually, to me, the most important one is that if you took some time, if you took a day or two, take them off, and read Matthew and Mark alongside each other, add John into the mix, they just don't look like, when you compare them, they don't look like accounts that were written by people who were eyewitnesses. For instance, let's use Matthew and John. It just seems very strange that Matthew and John's accounts are so different in chronology and also so different in the type of things that Jesus would say. It just seems highly improbable that Matthew would leave out the important sayings of John, like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, or me and the Father are one. It seems very strange that John would leave out the Passover meal altogether, which is such an important part. The point of that just simply is that when you put them together next to each other, they just don't look, unless you are predisposed to the idea that they are written by two witnesses. They just don't read like that. And there's a lot of discrepancies in that which seems to not be able to be solved and to always be harmonized perfectly. The fourth reason I now can't remember. Maybe I'll remember it as we go. But anyway, that's not the scope. There are very good reasons why scholars believe that the data actually points away. Yes, I do remember them. That the disciples of Jesus were fishermen, peasants from Galilee, and this is an important point. They were Aramaic. The chance that fishermen from Galilee, Aramaic speaking, would be able to read Greek, let alone write Greek, fluently at the level which we have our Gospels, is highly improbable. Literacy was not something that was very common in those times. I think the data sits at about 10 to 12% of people in the Roman Empire could read and write. These two things were not learned together, by the way. The point, it was only the absolute elite and the privileged schooled that could read and write in their own language, let alone the Greek language. So it's just highly improbable that someone like John the fisherman, or someone like, even specifically John, I think here, would be able to, even Matthew, be able to write Greek, write the Gospels at the level at which we have them in the Greek. So that's pretty important to us. So these are the four main reasons, and there's a lot of meat to them. We're not going to go into that today. My real aim today is to then ask the question, if it seems unlikely, if the data points in the direction that it's actually unlikely that these are first-hand accounts, that we do have eyewitness accounts, our Gospels, where do we get the idea that the Gospels were written by, and we're going to deal with, Matthew and Mark? Okay, so that's the question I want to answer today. And we want to find out where it is that our tradition has its foundation. All right. So, in order to do that, we need to go back into the history books. We need to go back and see where in the writings of the first or second century we can find people that actually names these gospels Matthew or Mark, or gospels according to Matthew and gospels according to Mark. So, for that, we go back to the early church fathers. The church fathers of the late first and second century are the ones we turn to see whether they name the Gospels when they do quote them. So, there are many quotations of our New Testament Gospels by the Church Fathers, especially from Matthew and Luke. What is of interest to our discussion is that none of the early quotations, in none of them, do any of the authors ascribe a name to the Gospels they are busy quoting. So, we're not disputing the Gospels, their authenticity, their earliness. They are a great source of information for us on the life of Jesus. The issue at hand is, did the early church fathers know that Matthew, that we have, Matthew in our Bibles, were written by Matthew the tax collector, or that the Gospel according to Mark in our New Testament was written by Mark, the companion of, at some point, Paul, but mainly of Peter. So this does strike us as very odd that the up until about 100 years after the writing of the Gospels, the last Gospels, nobody calls them by name, and this is strange to us, considering that our tradition stems from the fact that our tradition says that that's what they were. Everybody knew who wrote these things, and it just doesn't seem to be the case. Assigning authority to the quotation in these church fathers' writings would be as simple as indicating who wrote it, especially if it was an eyewitness or an apostle. In other words, the point is that during this era, if you were quoting something that Matthew the disciple said, you would say, and Matthew the disciple said. If you were quoting something that Mark, the companion of Peter, wrote, you would have used his name because it would have given authority to your writing. But we don't see the early church fathers doing this, although they are using, it seems like they are using material, sometimes verbatim from Matthew and Luke. They never assign their names to the quotations. So let's have a look at some of the church fathers, some of the early church fathers, and how they would use the Gospels. The first one is the book of 1 Clement. It's a letter written from Rome to Corinth in around 95 CE. So let's just have a look at our timeline very quickly. Jesus dies in 30 AD. Paul writes between 50 and 60 AD. The Gospel of Mark is believed to be written late 60s or 70 AD. The Gospel of Matthew and Luke to be written mid 80s AD, and the Gospel of John about 95 CE or AD. So here we have a bishop named Clement, and this book of 1 Clement is ascribed to him writing towards the very end of the first century. For instance, he would assign words to Jesus from a conflation of verses from Matthew and Luke, right? So we have Matthew and Luke in our Bibles. We see, hey, he is definitely using the material, but he never names the Gospels from which he actually draws. So the second example is the Didache. Didache is quite a well-known piece of ethical and practical instructions of the early church, probably written towards the end of the first century or beginning of the second century. The writer quotes from Mark 12, Matthew 5 and 7, and also from Luke 8. But he never names the Gospels. Later, he cites the Lord's Prayer virtually verbatim from Matthew 6, right? And again, he does not name the source. He doesn't say, as Matthew recorded, there's no mention of that. Okay, so number 3 is Ignatius of Antioch, which was a second century church father. And he is clearly acquainted with Matthew's story of the Star of Bethlehem and also Jesus' baptism that was undergone to fulfill all righteousness. But he also does not use the name of the gospel from which he draws the information. Our last example, Polycarp of Smyrna, very known for the way in which he was martyred. He quotes from Matthew 5, Matthew 7, and Matthew 26, also from Luke 6. But once again, all of these reputable church fathers, they do never say what they are quoting from. So in other words, they They are aware they have these writings somewhere, they're using them, but they do not say who wrote them. Now that is important for us to realize that this is weird, this is strange. In those times, this would have been a good practice to say Matthew the disciple, or Luke the companion, or Luke the doctor, or Mark the companion of Peter, but they never ever mention that. Now, some may say that this is an argument from omission or from silence, but the point is that if we never find that, we never find anyone mentioning the names Matthew or Mark connected, or Luke or John for that matter, connected to the Gospels, that should make us sit up and think. All right. So this is true of all the references to the Gospels prior to the end of the second century. The Gospels are known, they are read, they are quoted, they are assumed to be authoritative. They are used in this way, but they are never identified as Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Um, and they are also never associated with any eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. And we'll get to this later. This type of identification with the Gospels only starts really by the very end of the second century, and then becomes increasingly popular after the second century into the third century. Okay, so there is one exception, and it's this exception that has built the Christian tradition. And this is a church father by the name of Papias of Hierapolis. Okay, so we have fragmentary references to the Gospel of Matthew and Mark from the writings of Papias. He wrote in the early second century, and it is this Papias that makes the first claim about the authorship of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew during the second century. All right. The problem is this, that we need to have a look at Papias. We are worried, scholars are worried about Papias for several reasons. Let me jump the gun just slightly here. It doesn't seem like Papias is actually referring to the Matthew and the Mark that we have in our Bibles. We'll have a look at some of the reasons for that. That's number one. The second reason is it doesn't seem like Papias accepts even the Matthew and the Mark that he is speaking about as authoritative. And the last reason is the credibility of the witness of Papias himself. So let's have a look at those things, and as we just walk through some of these notes here. Okay, so Papias names Matthew and Mark as the authors of the Gospels. But this comes with a variety of problems that needs to be solved. It's very good and well to just say, oh, well, someone said it. But we can't build our entire lives, this life and the life to come, upon someone said it. We need to investigate, we need to see, and especially in the face of the data, the internal data of the Gospels showing in another direction. All right, so Papias was an early church father. In the second century, he wrote a book. It was a 5-volume book, and it was called Expositions and Sayings of the Lord. So these books probably contained the sayings of Jesus, his teachings as such. This was possibly written between 120 and 130 CE. Unfortunately, we have no copies of this book that survived to this day. What we do have, as is often the case, we have fragments or quotations in later church fathers of Papias's work, and that's all we have left of his work. So unfortunately, we don't have the full 5-volume book, but at least we have people like Eusebius in the 4th century that quotes Papias. And so that's the only reference we have as to what Papias actually wrote about. And it's also then in these fragments, these preserved quotations, that we have the references that Papias makes towards who wrote Mark and who wrote Matthew. So let's have a look at that. It does seem that for some reason, we're not sure, and we'll maybe have a look at a little bit of this. Scribes were not overly eager to copy his work, and that's why it kind of went into extinction. We have a lot of other early church fathers' work, complete works of Justin the Martyr, for instance, but for some reason, the scribes stopped copying Polycarp, and that's Papias, and that's why we don't have any of his writings. What is a little bit concerning to us is that Eusebius, who is considered the father of the proto-Orthodox or Orthodox Christianity in terms of history, is understood to be like a church historian or the church historian in the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea. He was of the opinion that Papias was, and I quote, a man of exceedingly small intelligence. Now, this is a very strange thing to say by a historian, especially of an early church father. Why does he kind of single him out in this way? Why does he degrade him in this way? What is it that Papias did that makes Eusebius write of him like this? And it's especially strange for us in light of the fact that Papias is, as far as I can see, Papias is the source that tells us who wrote Matthew and who wrote Mark. So why would you say that then about him if you're building your understanding of the authorship of the Gospels on his work? Okay, so as stated, our only access to Papias is from later church fathers and authors that quoted his work. In one of the more famous examples from Eusebius, Papias claims to have had knowledge about the authorship of some of the Gospels and access to people who knew eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. Papias claims that instead of reading about Jesus in writings, he prefers the stories, or what he calls the living voice. So he explains that whenever knowledgeable people would come to his church, when they came to visit, he would ask them what they knew and what they have heard from others. And then he claims to have spoken to people who had been companions of those who were called the elders, who had earlier been associates with the disciples of Jesus. So this is Papias' claim to fame, I guess, is that he feels like he has a line. It's not a direct line. It's a 3 or 4 segments or iterations back into the life of Jesus. And he actually prefers the stories and would search out these stories and these traditions when people came to him. So Papias is not an eyewitness himself, and he doesn't really claim to know an eyewitness either. Writing many years, possibly 80 to 90 years after Jesus' death, he indicates that he knew people who knew people who knew people who were with Jesus during his life. This is a remarkable claim, but as said, it's not really first-hand information by any chance. The 2 passages quoted from Papias is of very special importance to us. And some claim these quotations are the proof that the Gospels were written by Matthew and Mark. But Papias mentions Gospels written by Matthew and Mark. Here's the quotation in full. I quote. This is what Papias is writing. It's quoted by Eusebius in the 4th century. Here we go. This is what the elder used to say. Elder is like a presbyter, right? A leader of the church. When Mark was the interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately everything that he recalled of the Lord's words and deeds, but not in order. For he neither heard the Lord or accompanied him, but later, as I indicated, he accompanied Peter, who used to adapt his teachings for the needs at hand, not arranging, as it were, an orderly composition of the Lord's sayings. And so Mark did nothing wrong by writing some of the matters as he remembered them, for he was intent on just one purpose, not to leave out anything that he heard or include any falsehood among them. This is from Eusebius, end quote, from Eusebius Church History 3.39. Okay, so this is the place where we get the idea that the book of Mark is in fact Peter's version of the gospel, that Mark accompanied Peter, and that Mark is a kind of a summary. He wrote down what he could remember. And in fact, according to this, when we really listen to what Papias is saying, his understanding of Mark is this. Number one, it's not an orderly account of the sayings of Jesus. So it's not an orderly account of the sayings of Jesus. It's Peter's kind of version, but it's Mark later remembering Peter's teachings about what Jesus said, and acknowledging that these teachings were actually adapted um, for the matter at hand, as you would do with teaching. If you've been a teacher yourself, you know you adapt the teaching for the type of people that are in front of you. So the point is, this is where we get the idea that Mark actually wrote the book of Mark, and it kind of is a summary, but it's not an order, and it is a recollection of the teachings of Peter or Jesus through the adapted teachings of Peter. Okay, so Papias names a person by the name of Mark to be the interpreter of Peter. That wrote down to the best of his ability all he could remember of the sayings of Jesus from the adapted teachings of Peter, but not in the correct order. So there seems to be a lot of problems with this claim, and we're going to investigate that now. But first, the quotation concerning the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, quoting, and also Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew tongue, and each one interpreted them to the best of his ability. And this comes from the same book by Eusebius called Church History 3.39. Okay, so also with this statement, there's a couple of things we need to talk about before we can just accept it as solid evidence of authorship for our Gospels we now call Matthew and Mark. All right, so number one, none of the surviving quotations of Papias, in none of them does he actually quote Matthew or Mark. He does not give a teaching of Jesus or a summary of something he did, and then indicate that he found it in these Gospels. That would help a lot if he would quote a piece of Matthew verbatim and then say, this is from Matthew so and so. But even though he talks about what Jesus said, he never says this is from Matthew or this is from Mark. And so what's the issue? Well, it's very unfortunate because it actually means that we have no way of indicating or knowing for certain that he actually refers to the Gospel of Matthew we have in our canonical New Testament, or the Gospel of Mark that we have in our canonical New Testament. So it's an issue. In fact, there actually are reasons for doubting that he is referring to our Matthew and our Mark. And we're going to have a look at some of those reasons in a moment. But the second issue with Papias' statements, it seems like Papias did not consider the Gospels that he is talking about as authoritative. So why? Number one, he explicitly states that he prefers the stories. He prefers the living voice. So and that he doesn't find the written accounts useful at all. So what's going on there? If these are the writings of Matthew, the disciple, why does he prefer the stories? And why does he not see Matthew as authoritative and accept Matthew as that? That's the first thing. The second thing is that when Papias tells a story that overlaps with the account in Matthew, we have Matthew, and we have some of Papias' stories. It's clear that he doesn't consider Matthew's version as representing the gospel truth in the matter. He prefers his own version, possibly stuff that he got from stories. This can be best seen in Papias' own telling of the death of Judas. So according to Papias, Judas received a punishment from God after betraying Jesus. His body swelled up to a gigantic size so that he couldn't squeeze onto the street that had buildings on either side. Not even his head would fit, and his face became so fat that not even his eyes could be located on his face by a doctor. And his genitals became so enormously swollen and emitting pus and worms from it. Finally, he died by pouring out his innards on his own land. And he says that the stench was so bad that a century later, people could not walk past the land without holding their noses. Now, our Matthew, the canonical Matthew, also describes the death of Judas, but it's nothing like this. In Matthew, Judas hangs himself. If Papias considered our Matthew as an authoritative gospel, written by an eyewitness and disciple of Jesus called Matthew, as we know him as the tax collector, why does he prefer his own account? He should be accepting the account of the disciple Matthew as the correct version. So it just doesn't seem like, number one, he finds the Matthew he has as an authoritative gospel version, and it also seems like he differs from it and prefers his own version. So what's going on here? Well, the question is really, is he actually referring to the Matthew we have in our Bibles? Um, and that's the real question. And there are other reasons for thinking that he, in fact, is not. Here's one. When Papias makes comments about the gospel that was written by Matthew, he says two things that makes us really wonder whether he's really speaking about our Matthew, right? Two things. Number one, he indicates that the gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew. Many other early scholars, we assume that they have taken the lead from Papias, also assumed this. But today, almost every critical New Testament scholar on the planet agrees that Matthew was originally written in Greek. It is, of course, yes. So the point is this: here's the problem, and this is when data and hearsay don't align. Knowing that Matthew was written originally in Greek, what is he talking? What book is he talking about that was originally written in Hebrew? The second thing is that Papias calls Matthew a gospel consisting of the sayings of Jesus. When the gospel of Matthew in our Bible is not a gospel that consists of the sayings of Jesus. Our gospel is a narrative gospel. It's biographical in nature. It tells the entire story, and it contains the deeds, the life, and also the sayings of Jesus. Now you might say, Francois, this is not a big deal. But it actually is a big deal because we know of other gospels in the first 2 centuries that were exclusively gospels of the sayings of Jesus. First example would be something like the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, written in the 2nd century, was a gospel written not by Thomas. It was pseudonymous. So it was written, we don't know who it was written by, but the point is that it was 114 sayings, exclusively sayings about Jesus. So this is more or less in the time of Papias. These things were going around. The other example we know of was the material that is found in Matthew and Luke that is not found in Mark. That is the same, common to Matthew and Luke, not found in Mark. Also, estimate a source that was exclusively made up of the sayings of Jesus. No narrative, no birth narrative, no death and resurrection, exclusive sayings. So the point is simply that we have examples from from the first 2 centuries of gospels of sayings. So when Papias says that his Matthew consists of the sayings, we have to consider that he's not talking about our gospel, right? The sayings of Jesus is not a good description of the Gospel of Matthew that we have in our New Testament Bibles. So the thing is this, that if these questions are credible, how do we know that he is in fact referring to the Mark we have in our Bibles when he's referring to Mark in his quotations about the authorship of Mark? There's really no way to say. We know that he describes Mark as a disorderly account, in other words, in the wrong order. He doesn't make the same comment about Matthew, which is strange to us because we know today that Matthew is largely based on Mark. Matthew absorbs about 96% of Mark, the Gospel of Mark. And as far as scholars understand, Mark was written first and Matthew was written later. Because there are verbatim agreements, scholars assume that Matthew actually had Mark. And we also know that Matthew is the gospel that follows Mark the best. So the order in Matthew is based on the order in Mark, but yet he calls Mark a disorderly account, and he doesn't say the same about Matthew. The other thing is this, that Papias claims that Mark gives an account of the teachings of Peter. And it just, when we read our Mark, it will never strike you unless someone tells you beforehand and convinces you that it's the gospel truth. It will never strike you that our Mark is actually an account of Peter's teaching or Peter's version of events. Um, Peter is portrayed, maybe if Peter was portrayed as the hero, the protagonist of the whole thing, but Peter is a denying, unfaithful um, disciple who denies Jesus, runs away, and according to the original version of Mark, he never comes to the grave. He never sees Jesus again, according to that version. So the point is just, our gospel doesn't look like it was Peter's version. All right, so the point of this is to show that it doesn't seem like Papias is talking about our Matthew and our Mark. It seems to be referring to some other versions, which was, I mean, it's pretty likely that there were other versions of the Gospels out there. Maybe the Saints Gospel. Um, we just also note that his 5-volume work was also a sayings, seems to be a sayings orientated work. Okay, so these are the first two things. Papias doesn't take the version of Matthew he has as authoritative, if it is our one. Number two, it doesn't even look like he has our Matthew and our Mark. And the last version here, the last issue with Papias, is actually his credibility as a historical witness. And let me just read this. Papias makes other claims about Jesus, what he said, that doesn't align with any of our gospels or any of the historical material we have about Jesus, right? When people try to cling to Papias for the claims about the gospel authors, they tend to conveniently forget all the other claims that Papias makes about Jesus, the life of Jesus, and some of the writings that Papias wrote about what Jesus said. An example of this is the following, quoting Papias. Thus the elders who saw John, the disciple of the Lord, remember him, hearing him say how the Lord used to teach us about those times, saying, the days are coming when vines will come forth, and each vine will have 10,000 boughs, and on a single bough there'll be 10,000 branches, and indeed on a single branch there'll be 10,000 shoots, and on every shoot 10,000 clusters, and in every cluster there'll be 10,000 grapes, and every grape, when pressed, will yield 25 measures of wine. And when the saints grab hold of a cluster, another will cry out, I am better, take me, bless the Lord through me. So this is Eusebius quoting Papias on what Papias said about Jesus. Now, we don't find evidence of any of this anywhere in our Gospels or anywhere for that matter. It doesn't really make sense. It seems to be completely exaggerated. Probably talking about a post-apocalyptic kingdom where everything will be rosy. But if you go and make your calculations here, it just doesn't seem like something Jesus would have said. And the question is, did Jesus really say this? Did he really teach this? So does anyone really think that Judas was so bloated that his head could not fit between the buildings, that they could not locate his eyes, and that the stench of his innards lasted for a century? These are all the claims that Papias makes. But Papias, on top of all of this, this is what he says about the things that he says. I'm quoting, I will not hesitate to set down for you, along with my interpretations, everything I carefully learned from the elders and cheerfully remembered, guaranteeing their truth. Now, these could be the reasons why the scribes stopped copying Papias. This could also be the reason why Eusebius, 200 years later, calls him a man of exceedingly small intelligence, because he was saying some extravagant things and things that don't line up with the Gospels that by that time had been accepted as the four Gospels. Um, So the question is, why was Papias considered to be an accurate witness to the gospel authors when in the face of all these problematic issues? Um, the thing is, sorry, let me just make sure of this. The answer is the church needed it to be true. They needed Matthew to have written Matthew. They needed Mark to have written Mark to give authenticity and to anchor the New Testament Gospels in eyewitness testimony. Once again, just referring back to something I said a bit earlier on, that it was incredibly important to anchor writing scriptures to eyewitness or early testimonies or authors to give them credibility. So the church later did that, and they accepted Papias' witness of the authorship of Matthew and Mark. Okay, they didn't have all the data we have today, but the interesting thing is they accepted in the face uh, of all the other extraordinary claims that he was making. They stopped copying his work and then called him someone of small intelligence. However, one evaluates the overall trustworthiness of Papias. Today, most critical Bible scholars do not accept his version as accurate in the face of the internal evidence that we get from the Gospels themselves. Right? Okay, so next question. If this is true, and if no other early church father mentions, at least in most of the second century, none of them refer to the quotations from the Gospels as Matthew or Luke or Mark or John, how did we get to a place where we have four Gospels named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? All right, so that we'll do in the next 10 minutes. So the most important author from the middle second century is arguably Justin the Martyr. He was a philosopher turned Christian. He ran a philosophical school in Rome. We have three works from him, two apologies that offer reasoned defenses of the Christian faith against the charges of its intellectual rivals. And then lastly, thirdly, the dialogue with Rabbi Trypo about truth claims of Christianity over Judaism. But in these books, Justin quotes Matthew, Mark, Luke on several occasions, and possibly the Gospel of John twice. But he never calls them by name. He calls them memoirs of the Gospels. Memoirs of the Apostles. The quotations are quite jumbled, so it's difficult to tell where he is quoting from and who he is quoting at times. But some suggest that he might be quoting a type of harmony gospel at this stage. In fact, it was Justin's student Tatian who wrote a harmony gospel, and it was taking the gospels and harmonizing them all together. It no longer survives, but it was used for centuries in the Syrian church instead of separate gospels. But again, there is no evidence that Tatian, the one who makes this harmony gospel, knew the four gospels by the names we now know them. It is not until the end of the second century that anyone of record that excludes Papias quotes our four gospels and calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that happens in the writings of Irenaeus. Irenaeus is against heresies, and this happens in about 185 CE. So this is an important date for us. There were many various gospels in circulation by this time. We have them. You can go read them. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, maybe it might have been a bit late. Gospel of Peter. There are many of them, right? But Irenaeus in 185 is particularly keen to show that there's only four that are authoritative. In his view, there has to be four gospels because the earth has four corners, and the gospels has to go out to the four corners of the earth. Now, that's not a very convincing argument for people who today know that the earth doesn't have four corners, although he might have meant it metaphorically, as the Greeks knew very early on that the earth was round. Anyway, it's still not, if you just replace the four corners with four wind directions, seems to be a bit of an arbitrary way to choose how many gospels are authentic. So around the same time, possibly also in Rome, we have the Muratorian fragment. This is a fragment that was discovered in the 17th century. This fragment claims that the third gospel is Luke and the fourth gospel is John, thus indicating that there are at least four gospels, knowing the names of the last two. Thus, remarkably, before this time and place, we assume that both came more or less from Rome. Nowhere are the gospels said to be four in number, and nowhere are they named as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not even by Justin the Martyr. But now here, by the end of the second century, they are both numbered and they are both named. And how do we explain this transition? Right. So it needs to be pointed out that we don't start getting gospels with titles, the gospel according to Mark, by, for example, before the year 200 CE or AD. So the point is, if you open up your Bible today, you will see, go to the New Testament, you want to go to the book of Matthew, it says the gospel according to Matthew. Now those titles we don't find in the historical register until after 200 CE. Now that makes a lot of sense to us because it was only as far as we can see by 185 that the Gospels were said to be for and that they were named. Okay, so the text we do have of the earlier text we do have of the Gospels before 200 CE, we don't have the beginning of them, so it's impossible to see whether they have titles or not. The point is that if they had titles, people would have named them according to their titles very early on. Okay, um, so it is impossible to tell whether these Gospels had titles or not. But the point is that had the Gospels gone by their now familiar names from the outset, this is important, or even from the beginning of the second century, it is very hard to explain why the church fathers who quote them never called them by name, like the later church fathers do. Now, so here's the important thing for me. Well, this is what my takeaway is. Once they are named and distinguished from the others, the four authoritative, everyone starts calling them by their names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and every time they quote them, they add the name. So that to me is significant. One more reason for thinking that the Gospels did not originally circulate with these titles, according to Matthew, according to Mark, is that one would name the Gospels in order to differentiate them from other Gospels. Only once you have a collection of them do you need to start differentiating between them. So it seems like when Irenaeus started pointing out that we only want four, the term gospel was a problem because there was the gospel of Thomas, the gospel of this, the gospel of that, and many of those gospels contain things that the proto-Orthodox did not accept as true and right and truth, as Christians do today. And so they now had to distinguish between the gospels to make sure that people aren't reading the wrong stuff. This is where they probably numbered these four, and this is why they probably named them then according to Matthew, according to Mark. And it is only from this point on in the historical register that we find manuscripts of Matthew, of Mark, of Luke, of John that actually has names on them. Um, it is also quite strange that if Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, that he would call it the Gospel according to Matthew. It seems much more likely that it's a title someone else adds onto it to distinguish it from someone else's Gospel. So whoever gave these Gospels their names was someone who had a collection of them and wanted to identify which is which is good, which is bad, which should be authoritative, and which shouldn't. Remember, by this time, there's no canon. There's no New Testament formed yet by the end of the second century. That happens much, much, much later. So as far as we can tell from the evidence, that happened around 185 CE. And strikingly, both of our sources are connected to Rome. Irenaeus is against heresies and the Muratorian fragment. And after this time, everyone in the Orthodox communities seemed to agree that these four are the four authors of the Gospels. So what's the point of this whole story today? Well, the point is not to say we should accept all Gospels or that the ones we have are the wrong ones and that we shouldn't read them, they're not important. Please don't misunderstand that. The point of all of this is to show that most probably what happened is that these Gospels were written later by Greek-speaking authors that were not eyewitnesses, and that they were written anonymously. There are different accounts that came together from the oral traditions and the stories that the churches told about Jesus. That Papias was not either not referring to the ones we have, or that he was mistaken, and that it is only by the end of the second century, 185 AD, that the church in the form vis-a-vis Irenaeus started saying, no, we only accept these four, and these are the names. And from then on, the church accepted these four as the authoritative gospels about the life of Jesus, the biographies. And from that point on, when people quoted them, they named them. This is from Matthew, this is from Mark, this is from John, this is from Luke. Right. So, what's the point? Well, the point is that if you know that the Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses, it changes the way you read them, and it changes the way you use them, and that changes your life. And that's the point of today's story. Thanks so much for being with me. I'll see you again next time. Cheers. And now I don't know how to end this thing. Well, where the ending button is not normally here, now it's not here. Oh, goodness.